when we talk about the book of Isaiah chapter 17, which talks about the destruction of Damascus. Many of our commenters and many of our discussions, people have said, I could see this happening under Bashar al-Assad because let's just say he's not the wisest of leaders, folks. What will the Israel Defense Forces be focused on in 2022? When the IDF looks across the landscape at the various threats gathering against the nation of Israel, really against the region and the world, what are they preparing for the most as we head into a new year? Okay. Times of Israel laid it out pretty well today. The Israel Defense Forces believes, key point here, that it significantly curbed Iran's ability to transfer weapons and equipment through Syria over the past year through Israeli airstrikes. And the IDF plans to continue with those airstrikes in Syria in 2022. No surprise there. We're going to talk about this more in a minute. Of course, on yesterday's newscast, if you missed it, check it out in our archives. We talked about a major Israeli airstrike in the Syrian port of Latakia, where Iranian weapons shipments have been transiting. But interesting here and encouraging that the IDF believes that it has curbed, quote, Iran's ability to transfer those kind of weapons through Syria. The airstrikes are working in Syria, according to the Israel Defense Forces. And this Times of Israel piece goes on to say that the Israeli military hopes that these attacks, the airstrikes, will also drive a wedge between Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad and Tehran. Meaning, look, let's create friction between the Assad regime in Syria, which is hosting Iranian and Hezbollah forces on its soil, and Iran. We've heard some rumblings over the past few weeks over the past few months, that perhaps Assad is not too happy about some of Iran's moves on Syrian soil. In particular, Iran and Hezbollah doggedly attempting to establish a presence on the Golan Heights, right across the border from Israel. And that incurs the wrath of Israel. Not surprisingly, Israel says this is a total red line, and they're pushing Iranian and Hezbollah forces back from the Golan. Guess what? When Israel strikes at those Iranian and Hezbollah forces, sometimes there are members of the Syrian military there as well, Assad's military. And Assad also feels some of the effects, for sure, on many occasions over the years. The Assad regime's forces have also been hit in these strikes. And the hope is, it seems, that Assad will grow impatient with this and say to Iran, enough is enough, you have to leave. I find that very unlikely. Not that Assad would grow impatient. He's pretty much firmly in charge of most of Syria right now. He might be feeling kind of good about himself after literally 10 years. I mean, the Syrian civil war kicked off in March 2021. Assad clearly has won the upper hand over the past few years. Perhaps now he's saying, I'm the top dog once again. And you know what, Iran, I'm sick of listening to you. This is my country. I'm back in charge now. Perhaps he's not the wisest leader. When you think of Isaiah 17, that's why many, when we talk about the book of Isaiah chapter 17, which talks about the destruction of Damascus, many of our commenters and many of our discussions, people have said, I could see this happening under Bashar al-Assad because let's just say he's not the wisest of leaders, folks. So who knows how he's feeling right now, and also there's been some talks now between Assad officials and the United Arab Emirates, different Sunni Arab nations. There's been some chatter about kind of bringing Assad and Syria back into the community of Sunni Arab nations. Will that happen? We don't know. But the goal in all of this is to create daylight and distance between Assad and the Iranian regime. Here's the problem. Iran's not going to allow that. Iran is not going anywhere, in their view at least. They are in Syria to stay. They're in it for the long haul because, folks, in case you haven't noticed, Syria is absolutely crucial. It's essential to Iran's ideological goals for the region. And that is, number one, to form a land corridor from Iran all the way across Iraq and Syria and Lebanon to the Mediterranean Sea. Persian empires over the centuries have dreamed of having that land corridor. That's exactly what Iran wants. And number two, Syria is the spot where Iran wants to transit weapons through into the hands of Hezbollah. Number three, Syria, a Syrian presence enables Iran to greater encircle Israel with that ring of fire. For all those reasons and more, Iran's not letting go of their Syrian presence. It's not going to happen. Assad might want that ultimately. He might want some independence, but Iran's not going to allow that. Neither is Hezbollah. And at the end of the day, he owes a great deal. He owes, in many cases, his hide and his continued existence to the Iranian regime, Hezbollah, and of course to Russia, which intervened in Syria in September 2015. And guess what? They're also there to stay, the regime of Vladimir Putin. So Assad owes them a lot, and they're not going to let him forget that. So big doubt that he would, first of all, have the capability to tell Iran what to do and to boss Iran around. But secondly, that Iran would heed any kind of orders from Bashar al-Assad. He is an Iranian. In many cases, you could say he's an Iranian puppet at this point, whether he likes it or not. So while I do encourage attempts to separate and to cause discord among the enemies of Israel and America, let's just say I find it unlikely that Iran is going any place anytime soon when it comes to Syria, unless they are physically forced out. And Israel has done quite a job over the past few years. And as we saw from this Times of Israel article I just quoted from, has done quite a good job in terms of slowing down Iran's drive through Syria. Folks, remember, Iran and Hezbollah threw their hats in the ring in such a major way in Syria. Why? Because in the earliest days, and really up until 2015, from 2011 to 2015, Bashar al-Assad was on the ropes and then some. You had ISIS, other jihadi groups, and other non-jihadi groups, rebel groups, all vying for supremacy in Syria. What, 500,000 people killed, many women and children over the past 10 years there in this bloody, horrific civil war. But Iran was panicking, and I don't use that word lightly, because they said to themselves, our man Assad, this was pre-2011, we have our man Assad. And look, Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar, also had a strong relationship with the Iranian regime going back decades. And Iran said, we have an ally, a kindred anti-Israel spirit in Syria. We're good. So Iran said, we need to get weapons through the Lebanon, and he's going to let us do it. All of a sudden, that was in jeopardy. Forces hostile to Iran, there was a chance they could seize most of Syria. So Iran said, we can't let this happen. And they threw in a good amount of troops and Iranian Revolutionary Guards, foot soldiers, and they demanded that their most lethal and powerful proxy, Hezbollah, also got involved in Syria. And Hezbollah, by the way, has paid a heavy price and lost a good amount of men in Syria fighting in that civil war over the years, as has Iran. But that tells you, folks, that Iran is playing for keeps. If Iran wasn't serious about its ideological goal, its stated ideological goal to wipe Israel off the map, then Iran wouldn't have invested so much in Syria. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman Newscast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, make sure you go ahead and hit the like button, click subscribe, and tap the bell icon to turn on notifications for new Watchman Newscast episodes every weekday.